Dead Road, Transpolar Highway, the most famous and bloody underdevelopment of the USSR.
The Dead Road. It was the fate that the construction of the Salekhard-Igarka highway had no established name. The Transpolar Road once it was called. It went down in history by the numbers of construction departments number 501 and 503 of the USSR NKVD. But the name Dead Road most suits it, reflecting the fate of both the highway itself and many of its builders, who fell in the harsh working conditions and climate. So let's look where this place located on our Earth. Construction of the road. After the Great Patriotic War, the country's leadership and Stalin clearly understood the vulnerability of the strategic road, the Northern Sea Road. Its main ports, Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, were located too close to the western borders of the Soviet Union. In the event of a new war, communication of the NSR could easily be paralyzed by the enemy. It was decided to create a new port in the Ob Bay, near the Kameny Cape, and to connect by a 700-kilometer railway with the already existing Kotlas-Vorkuta line. The construction of the line began at the same time as finding a place for the future port. After a while, it turned out that the Ob Bay wasn't at all suitable for such construction. Very shallow depths, large windbreaks, and water surges do not allow for the construction of any large port on its shores. The technical conditions of the line construction were as light as possible. Bridges over the Ob, Pur, Taz, and Yenisei were not planned at the first stage. Their function was to perform ferry crossing in the summer and ice crossing in the winter. Earthworks were carried out mainly by hand. Long-distance transport of soil was carried out by a few cars. Embankment filling by hand. Annually, 100 to 140 kilometers of the road were surrendered on the western section, while the eastern section was much less. Lack of the people and difficulty in transporting materials affected. On this construction site, the terrible phase, which was burn-out building of the Pechora Highway, about the person under each sleeve, has found the literal sense. Thus, Simonova from Tashkent, who worked in 1970s as an engineer on the research and completion of the site Nadim Urengoy, personally saw piles of skeletons after erosion of the banks of the Heta River and the corpse in the embankment 660 to 612 kilometers line. That's how the road was nicknamed the Road on the Bones. Only God knows how many people died there. A telegraph along was built at the whole road, and the telephone line, which until the 17th connected Taimyr with outside the world. Operation of this section was stopped only in 1992. The stop of construction. After Stalin's death, when more than 700 out of the 1,290 kilometers of the road had already been laid, almost 1,100 kilometers had been covered, and the construction was stopped for about a year before being put into operation. Already on March 25, 1953, there was issue on to complete the stop of all the works. Soon 293 camps and construction departments were disbanded. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were granted amnesty, but they managed to go south only when they started navigating. There were no other ways yet. According to some estimates, about 15,000 prisoners were removed from 501 and 503 construction sites, and about the same number of freelancers and their families. Everything they could was taken to the big land, but most of the construction was simply abandoned in the taiga and tundra. Economists later calculated that the decision to abandon construction of such a degree of readiness led to losses for the budget of the country much greater than if the road had been completed. Not to mention its promising continuation to Norilsk industrial region, where the richest deposits of iron, copper, nickel and coal were already being developed. The giant gas deposits in the western Siberia have not yet been discovered. Who knows? Maybe then the fate of the road would have been quite different. That road today in abandoned trains. Practically untouched, they stay there, the most difficult to access of all. Almost untouched preserved paths, buildings, depot, and the 4 steam locomotives of the famous ship of pre-revolutionary construction. One of the track near the depot were several dozen of cars, mainly platforms, but there are also several covered ones. One of the cars got here from the post-war Germany after conversion to the domestic 15-20 mm track at 15 km from Dolgoye. There are the remains of the camp, and not far from the depot on the other bank of the brook there are the remains of the freelancers workers settlement and the construction administration, consisting of almost 24 buildings as well as wooden ferry lying on the shore. The future fate of the dead road now looks less gloomy, but the reserves of its deposits are quite large, and the world needs nickel and polymetals. Well, who knows? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks and bye.